مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الحرب الباردة الجديدة تزداد سخونة. في أوروبا بلدان محايدان كالسويد وفنلندا يقرران الانضمام إلى خلف الناتو لكي يدعن مستقبل بلدهما بين يدي الخلف بدلاً من مواجهة التهديد الروسي بمفردهما أسوة بموقف أوكرانيا الشجاع. وفي آسيا أكد الرئيس بايدن في الآن ما يخمس به المسؤولون عادة في الصين، وهو أن الولايات المتحدة ستدافع عن تايوان إذا قامت الصين باجتياحها. هل إعلان الالتزام بمساعدة تايوان وزيادة حجم الناتو سيكون لهما أي تأثير؟ هل تقوية الرادع سيجعل الحرب أكثر أم أقل احتمالاً؟ لمناقشة هذه الأسئلة المهمة يسرني أن أستضيف المتناظرين الخبيرين في السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to داخل Washington. The unimaginable may in fact be possible. Ukraine might not only survive the Russian invasion, but it may win the conflict. But what does winning actually mean? And how do we get there? To discuss this issue, and then to broaden the discussion to global conflict, how we're preventing a China invasion of Taiwan, and what Joe Biden might be doing in the Middle East before long, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of foreign policy experts, Juan Zarate and Dennis Ross. So, gentlemen, victory in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. How does Zelensky define it? How does the United States government define it? And most importantly for this show, how do you define it? Juan, let me begin with you.
Rob, I think President Zelensky has a maximalist view of what victory means for Ukraine, and that means repelling the Russian invasion, pushing them back from territorial control, and recovery of the territory, including Crimea, that Russia has taken in the past. And so Zelensky has not only sort of proven to be a great wartime leader, but has really defined the scope of victory for Ukraine, and it has a maximalist dimension. I think for the United States and perhaps European partners, victory for Ukraine is less ambitious, but no less significant. That is to say, stopping Russian ambitions to take control of significant parts of Ukrainian territory, certainly the land bridge on the eastern and southern coast, all the way through Odessa and into Crimea. And certainly having Russia be bogged down. That is to say, Russia not able to advance militarily and to control territory the way that they have wanted since the start of the invasion. I think, victory will be defined different ways. And I think this is why you're seeing a debate as to what a negotiated solution should look like, whether or not Ukraine should offer territorial concessions to Russia for the sake of peace. But I think at this point, the Ukrainians are fighting. They're fighting to win. And that means for them repelling the Russians and taking back territory. And the United States seems to be, along with European allies, willing to support that war effort, at least to bog the Russians down.
So, Dennis, how do you define victory, and how do you manage the daylight between these various other definitions of victory?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question, because one of the things that always worries me is when the nature of the objective is not very clear. And right now, I think there's a kind of ambiguity to what constitutes the objective. I think Juan is quite right. There is a distinction between how Zelensky and the Ukrainians are looking at it, which I would say, by the way, is probably different than it was early in the war. The higher the price has become, the more determined the Ukrainians have also become to ensure that the Russians are forced off the territory. Now, in the end, will they keep to that exact position given the high price that they're clearly paying? We will see, but they certainly want to build their leverage vis-a-vis the Russians. It's pretty clear when you look at the Germans, the French, and the Italians, they're much more open to the idea of getting a ceasefire and beginning a negotiation as a result of that ceasefire. I think the Biden administration has adopted the position that we need to support what the Ukrainians want. Here again, we'll see as the price goes up within Ukraine, is there some readiness quietly to talk to the Ukrainians about, do we scale back a little bit what you're trying to achieve, but with the use of a particular lever, which we will have, we collectively, there should be no lifting of the sanctions against the Russians until the Russians are actually at least back to where they were prior to February 24th. I think the key for us is also to bear in mind something, I want to highlight that Juan said. What's important here is not just the nature of victory for Ukraine, but also the nature of the defeat for the Russians. A country that has 6,000 nuclear warheads, you don't want to put them in the corner. On the other hand, you want to demonstrate pretty clearly that what they did came at an enormous cost to them, so that it's not particularly attractive to them in the future or to anybody else to follow that kind of a model.
The United States is providing massive support, another $40 billion in aid just approved. But there's hesitation in giving the Ukrainians types of weaponry that would allow them to take the battle to Russia itself. Why should we be reluctant to make the Russians, taste the cost of battle themselves, given everything that they've inflicted on the poor Ukrainians? Juan?
Yeah, I think what you've seen in Washington, Rob, has been a reticence to be too aggressive in the involvement of the U.S. and Europe in the conflict, so as not to provoke Russia. To Dennis's point, not to put Russia in a corner and to avoid escalation and entanglement. And I think that too has been blurred. There's been lack of clarity, I think, in the American policymaking community as to what that actually looks like. What are those boundaries? How far are we willing to go? And frankly, what really is a trigger to Russian escalation? I think there have been some critics, such as myself, who've said we've given Putin sort of the upper hand in defining what escalation looks like. And we've been very binary. That is to say, we assume that any action will provoke ultimate escalation, including nuclear response from Russia, as opposed to creating 1,000 steps on the escalatory ladder that we can then work in and through. And so I think what you see with the U.S. has been a greater and greater appetite for support to Zelensky and Ukrainians as they've demonstrated an ability to fight. But I think there is still a blurry line that is holding the United States back, including with fighter jets, so as not to provoke the Russians too much and not to involve NATO in the conflict.
Dennis, I had to, I had to pinch myself when I heard this back and forth between President Zelensky and Henry Kissinger in the last recent days. It just conjured up memories of how we tried to manage the end of the October 1973 war, where the Israelis could encircle but not destroy the Third Army of Egypt, so as to provide a way to begin the negotiations that would soon follow. But this is a very different conflict, isn't it?
Well, it is a very different conflict, and first of all, the relationship of the United States to Ukraine is not the same as the United States to Israel. Secondly, we have been in what I would describe as a different era today as to what we were at that point. That was an era of bipolarity, two superpowers, and the hesitancy over what you do in terms of the risk of escalation at a time when the Soviets were in fact raising they had actually put nuclear weapons on ships that were moving towards the area, and we went to DEFCON 2, the second highest alert that we could go to. We're not in that kind of situation now, but I think as Juan has been pointing out, there's been this kind of effort to calibrate, overly calibrate, what are the boundaries here? Putin, from the very beginning, sought to create intimidation by raising the alert status of his nuclear forces. It's pretty clear he was using this primarily as a coercive tool. Now, it doesn't mean, as I said, that you can do anything, but there's a big difference between some of the weapons we would be providing, even hitting across into Russia, and putting Putin in a position where Russia might lose in a way that was so dramatic that he would see that the cost of using nuclear weapons suddenly became one that was much more manageable. Understanding that distinction, I think, is important versus the distinction when we provide multiple rocket launchers, can we do it with a range of 45 miles or 186 miles? And the concern that we need to get commitments from Ukraine, don't fire them across the border. I mean, the fact is, if there is Russian artillery or missiles that are being fired from within Russia, but they're relatively close to the border, are those really not legitimate targets? I mean, I don't mean to trivialize this, and I don't mean to suggest there isn't a dilemma here. There is a dilemma here. And I understand the need to err, because you don't, if there's a 10% chance that nuclear weapons could be used, that's too high. So you do have to calibrate this. But one thing we've seen with Putin, he may not calculate correctly, but he's never demonstrated a suicidal impulse. And we have acted as if that's who he is. We have allowed him in many ways to bluff us. And I think one of the concerns I have is we could have been providing much of the equipment that we're providing now much earlier. Had we done so, the odds are this war would have ended sooner.
Right. All right. Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to take our discussion about Ukraine and shift it to Taiwan, see how Ukraine affects the China-Taiwan potential conflict, and how perhaps in reverse, how the lens through which we look at China-Taiwan may affect what we do in Ukraine. In just a moment. Somewhere, some Hollywood producer has already commissioned some writer to produce a script for what will be a blockbuster film, the heroic defense of Ukraine, led by a defiant, determined former comedian and a one-time boxer turned mayor of the capital city. You can't make this up. But until the film version of the current drama is made, you'll have to suffice with movies of amazing underdog military victories from the past, the most stunning of which, in my view, was 300, the fictional account of the amazing victory of 300 Spartan warriors against a Persian invading force many, many times that size. I say fictional because the real story of Thermopylae was more complicated. There were more Spartans and their allies. The outcome was not quite as decisive, but why let the details get in the way of a terrific tale? So until you can watch today's stars take on the roles of Volodymyr Zelensky, Vitaly Klitschko, and Vladimir Putin, sit back and enjoy Gerard Butler as Leonidas, King of Sparta, in the 2006 film 300. War will never seem the same. Again, our guests today include Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross, just back from Saudi Arabia, is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years experience, bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Bush, Reagan, Obama, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Also joining us is my friend Juan Zarate, one of our nation's leading national security experts. Juan is global co-managing partner of K2 Integrity, a risk management firm. He's also chairman of the Center on Economic and Financial Power and senior national security analyst for NBC News. Juan served in the George W. Bush administration, holding the titles of Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. Before we turn to Asia, just one more specific Ukraine question. Sweden, Finland, compelled to change years, decades, sometimes centuries of neutrality to want to now join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Is this likely to hasten a quicker end, compel the Russians to bring about the end of this conflict, or is this going to dig Russian heels in more deeply? Dennis, what do you think?
I don't think it's going to change the nature or the length or duration of this conflict, but I think it's a reminder that Vladimir Putin basically has produced a strategic defeat for Russia. Everything he was seeking to do with the invasion of Ukraine was to rewrite the rules of the security architecture within Europe. And the irony is he's doing that, but exactly in the opposite way in which he intended. Rather than creating new fissures within NATO, he is bringing NATO forces much closer to his border, and he's turning two countries who were always neutral into part of the NATO alliance. He has succeeded in strengthening NATO, and he's succeeded in transforming Germany. The idea that Germany would triple its defense spending, adopt a very different posture, is one that would have been frankly unthinkable prior to the fact that he went in. So whatever his strategic aims, and we could easily detail them, what he's produced is exactly the opposite. So a strategic defeat for Russia, not a strategic victory.
All right, so Juan, I want to shift gears. Just around the same time as President Biden signed the $40 billion in additional aid for Ukraine, he also drew a new line in the sand regarding the defense of Taiwan. So I know the White House has tried to walk it back a little bit, but the president was pretty clear about ending some sense of strategic ambiguity about defending Taiwan from potential Chinese invasion. What actually did he say? Why did he say it? What impact will it have?
Well, what Biden actually said was that the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion, which did pierce the ambiguity of the one China policy that the U.S. has relied upon and that China has relied upon in the bilateral relations. What Biden was really doing at this moment was putting a marker down with respect to what American defense and obligations look like, what the U.S. is committed to, and what that looks like through the lens of what we're doing with Ukraine. I think, as we've talked about on this show, Rob, there's been enormous amounts of doubt and question around American commitment to our allies, and a creeping sense of an age of impunity and the age of authoritarian states being able to use power and realpolitik to push their interests to the detriment of U.S. and U.S. allies. And I think what you have in the Ukraine moment is really the United States sort of finding itself again, Europe in particular finding itself, NATO being revitalized, amplified and expanded, and a real sense that the international community led by the United States can push back in the face of authoritarian aggression. And I think this is intended to be a moment, not just with respect to the statement around Taiwan, but also with the use of sanctions, with the international opprobrium, with the economic decoupling. All of these are signals to China that they can't simply do what they want, especially in the wake of what they've done in Hong Kong to reframe and reshape that society. So this is really a critical moment, I would say, for American power and posture. And I think President Biden was articulating quite plainly what is the intended focus, which is to push back on authoritarian aggression.
All right, gentlemen, Juan Zarate, Dennis Ross, thank you so much for taking a look at the globe, Ukraine, Taiwan, the Gulf, Israel. Terrific discussion. Thank you for joining me on Dachel, Washington. In 1989, just after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was collapsing, a brilliant scholar named Francis Fukuyama published an article and later a book that changed the way we think about the world. It was titled The End of History, and its basic idea was that we had reached the point in human development when there was global consensus that liberal democratic capitalism was the optimum way to organize societies. All other forms, absolute monarchies, socialism, communism, for example, having disintegrated of their own inner contradictions. It was a very hopeful lesson. 3 years later, another brilliant scholar named Samuel Huntington published an article and later a book that also changed the way we think about the world. It was titled Clash of Civilizations, and its basic idea was that a contest between religious, ethnic, and cultural identities would replace ideological competition as the driving force for conflict in the world, and we would witness more, not less, such conflict in the post-Soviet era. Two very different ways of looking at the world, not wholly contradictory, but largely so. For a time, it looked like Fukuyama was right. The 1990s were a decade of political escapism, when we could revel in our largely bloodless victory in the Cold War, congratulate ourselves, turn inward, and forget causes of conflict around the world. When the Soviets disappeared, the glue that kept the bipartisan consensus in American political and national security life disappeared too. And soon we started the vicious and debilitating cycle of one party questioning the very validity of the other party's political success and turning instead to scorched earth politics like impeachment to win at all costs. But that moment didn't last long. Even before September 11th, 2001 brought the clash of civilizations to our homeland, Europe saw itself engulfed in the post-Soviet collapse of the multi-ethnic state of Yugoslavia, eventually resulting in the first genocide on the European continent since the Holocaust. History, alas, had not ended at all. Flash forward 30 years, and we have before us what can be called the revenge of history. It's not only back with a vengeance. Everywhere from Taiwan to Ukraine, we now know it never really left. What's really back is the need for American leadership to confront the same threats we faced in the 20th century. Today, toward the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, it is clear old habits die hard in Europe and in Asia. In these early days, President Biden has carried the flag of leadership with surprising spine and resolution, especially for a country that longs to be left alone, as does America. But we are just at the beginning of what may be a long, costly struggle. History, it is now clear to all, has not ended. For all we know, it may only have just begun. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن التخلف غير المستقر بين روسيا والصين، تواصلوا معي رجاءً عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكراً وإلى اللقاء.